Well, Republican Governor Rick Scott says Florida's voter purge, if you will, is aimed at clearing registration rolls of non-citizens. Critics say it's nothing more than an effort to disenfranchise poor and minority voters who tend to tilt to the Democrats. In a state where a small number of ballots can swing a presidential race, never happened in Florida. Thursday, a federal judge seemed to agree, and he issued a preliminary injunction for parts of the measure. Joining me now is Michael Waldman. He's president of the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University, and Brian Darling, who's a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you both. Michael, I want to start with you. Why did you file? You've been part of this, your group has been part of fighting these laws in a lot of states, but particularly in Florida. Why are you cheering the decision by the federal government to step in here?
Well, Chuck, you know, Florida has moved forward on a number of different fronts to make it harder for people to register to vote or to vote. So this is really about two things in the past week. On Thursday, a federal judge blocked the law that Governor Scott signed that made it very, very hard for groups like the League of Women Voters to do voter registration, that shut down voter registration drives. The League actually shut down its voter registration operations. The judge said this was clearly something that had no legitimate purpose other than it seemed to make it harder for constitutionally protected activity to occur. That's happening at the same time as the Justice Department said, hey, wait a minute, this voter purge that Governor Scott is also talking about looks like it's going to heavily impact minority voters. 58% of the names on the list were Hispanic. And you don't want people being on the rolls who aren't eligible to vote, but to do it so close to the election, to do it in secret, to do it without input, with the local officials up in arms saying it's not working well, that's a recipe for Florida 2000 style disaster.
Brian, I know that you guys have been fighting on the other side of this. What I don't understand is that it feels like a lot of these laws are solutions in search of a problem, and that they're done hastily so that whether you believe that there was that there is a reason to do it, that you have some evidence, that your side isn't searching for the evidence first. They're basically putting the laws in place and saying, no, trust us, there's voter fraud. This is preventing voter fraud.
Well, the states are reasonable to try and get rid of voter fraud, and there have been examples of it. I mean, if you look at Florida, the Miami Herald did a study, and they found out in 2000 there were about 2,000 people that voted in 2000 that shouldn't have been voting. So Florida has found about 180,000 people on the rolls that they want to investigate to make sure that they're legally on the rolls. And we're not talking about illegal immigrants. We're talking
why not just investigate that? Why change the law? I guess that's what I don't understand. Well, why change the law to make voter registration drives? And particularly when you are doing this in the South, it brings back some bad memories.
Sure, but this law and the court, what the court did in this case very specifically said 48 hours, that's too short a period of time to take that signature and get it into the state.
So you believe the judge is right on this? That it was unreasonable?
No, what the state of Florida said is that voter registration drives do not implicate First Amendment activity. They don't restrict the right to vote. They're saying, the state of Florida is saying that the federal government doesn't have any role in voter registration drives. Now, reasonable people can probably disagree, and probably 48 hours should be extended a little bit more, but I don't know if it's a constitutional issue as much as it's a political issue.
Michael, let me ask you about the voter ID front, and I think we've had this conversation before. At some point, I understand that we still have roughly anywhere from 5 to 10%, particularly of older populations, without ID, without a government-issued ID. That's going to change in the next 5 to 10 years. Are you going to be more open to voter ID laws?
I'm very open to voter ID laws if they're about kinds of ID that people actually have, and there are states where the kinds of ID required are very broad, or where there's a fail-safe if you don't have it. The problem, as you say, is that we estimate as many as 10% don't have it, and a lot of it is seniors and a lot of it is more poor people, and that really goes to the tragedy of the whole thing.
But
we could make it so that everybody could vote.
They can still vote provisionally. I mean, they're still allowed to provisionally vote if they can come back and prove they're a legal voter.
But that means that a senior who is old and doesn't have their driver's license has to go back a second time, schlep themselves over to the government office, stand in line and prove who they are. That's not democracy, and that really isn't how we ought to be running elections. We could make this so easy. We could put everyone who's eligible's name on an electronic voter list, and that would add tens of millions of people to the rolls and guarantee that whatever problems there are don't recur. That's a bipartisan or nonpartisan solution that everybody, I think, ought to be behind.
Brian, that
and if we
sounds
can
fairly
get past
reasonable.
the voter wars, we'll be able to get there.
Maybe, but as you know, these voter laws are constitutional. Voter ID laws were held to be constitutional in 2008 in the Indiana case. It was a 6-3 decision, so you can't argue it was on partisan lines. So what the state of Florida is doing is perfectly reasonable and constitutional.
You're perhaps a little garbled or jumbled in what you're saying. We're not talking in this instance about voter ID laws, and that's the point, is that unfortunately Florida and other states are moving forward with every different kind of law they can come up with, it seems, to make it harder for people to vote. And so again, the League of Women Voters is a very respected and mainstream organization doing good work for years. I'm glad they may be in a position now legally to move forward with voter registration. We ought to be, the tragedy is that right now 4 out of 10 eligible voters in the state of Florida, eligible voters, are not registered to vote. What can we do to make that change?
Let me ask you this. It does seem that you're seeing the two parties break on, and that the Republicans simply want more rules in place to make it a little bit harder to register to vote and vote. Why?
Well, they want to make sure to get rid of voter fraud, and there have been examples of voter fraud in Florida.
I mean, it is
look
not
at Acorn,
like
look
this
at
giant. We're talking about
examples.
1 or 2 people here, 1 or 2 people, and we're not even 100% sure.
We just had a Michigan congressman resign and not run for re-election because he gathered signatures, his campaign gathered signatures that couldn't be validated.
But that's a case of petition signatures being valid. I mean, that's a different law here.
Yeah, but it's very hard to catch voter fraud. Look at what James O'Keefe did. He walked into D.C. He didn't have any ID. One of his guys
vote?
No, he didn't vote.
He
didn't vote, but he asked for a ballot, and they were going to give it to him.
But you're actually proving the point here, that the fraud didn't take place because they prevented it.
But it's very hard to catch the fraud. That's why you have to do it before Election Day. If you try and do it on Election Day, you'll never catch any of the fraud.
Chuck, listen to the absurdity of that. It's so hard to find. It must be everywhere, so let's make laws that make it harder for millions to vote.
But why is it so bad to do it now? What's so wrong with the state of Florida taking corrective action before the election to try and prevent voter fraud? There's nothing wrong with that, and it's constitutional.
The problem is when you take actions that have a risk, more than a risk, of kicking out from the rolls eligible voters, veterans, people who've served the country. We ought to be able to make the elections secure without disenfranchising many, many Americans. And if we put aside the partisan gimmickry, we could do that.
This is a debate that's going to take place in 50 states, I think, and for a few years to come. Brian Darling, Michael Wellman, thank you both. And thank you for the very civil discussion, by the way, on this issue. I appreciate that.